Welcome everyone. I'm Gladys Changachirere. I'm the founding director of the Institute for Young Women Development, which promotes the participation of young women in decision-making and politics in Zimbabwe. I'm also the founding coordinator of the African Women Leaders Forum and a proud member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy. I will be moderating this session and I'm looking forward to insightful conversations from my panelists. We are going to have a conversation around understanding and designing the 21st century solidarity. As we engage in this conversation, it is really our hope that at the end of it, we would have managed to make sure that we unpack as well as to have everyone understand contemporary strategies for facilitating effective solidarity in our different countries as well as across the globe. To have this conversation, I am joined by two respected civil society leaders. I have with me Antoine Bernard. Antoine Bernard is the Director of Global Advocacy and Strategic Litigation, and he is the Deputy Director General of Reporters Without Borders, a faculty member at Sciences Po School of International Affairs, a senior fellow at Institute for Advanced Judicial Studies. He serves as a board member for the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression. He is also the Secretary General of the Women's Home La Maison des Femmes in Saint Denis and jury member of the Simone Veil Award for Gender Equality. Welcome, Antoine. I also have with me here Daria Kalinic. Daria is the co-founder and executive director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, a powerful national organization that has shaped Ukraine's anti-corruption legislation and efforts. She also serves as a member of the Council of Public Oversight at the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. She specializes in international legal mechanisms for combating corruption, particularly on returning the stolen assets and tools for countering the money laundering practices. Welcome, Daria.
Thank you.
And welcome everyone to this discussion. In an earlier session today, panelists discussed the limitations of international community to support democracy movements due to the current global political context. They also emphasized the importance of multilateral platforms and networks, like networks of political parties, networks of young political actors, to not just express solidarity via collective statements, but also facilitate peer-to-peer and intergenerational learning and training. An example we had earlier on is of the Canadian Parliament, where one of the parliamentarians, where some of the Canadian MPs are paired with fellow parliamentarians at risk in different countries. For example, my fellow member of the World Movement Steering Committee, Anita van den Belde, who is a Canadian MP, is paired with Filipino Senator Leila de Lima. Senator Lima is a vocal critic of President Rodrigo Duterte, and she has been in jail since 2017 on politically motivated allegations. Whenever Anita has a chance, she raises concerns about the imprisonment of Senator de Lima. To discuss how we should design and mobilize effective solidarity among democracy advocates, we have the two civil society leaders that I have introduced earlier on. Now I want to turn to you, my respected speakers. It seems there are a lot of political crises happening around the world today. Democracy movements in so many places are under attack: Burma, Belarus, Hong Kong, Nicaragua, Russia, and Egypt. It is a long list of countries where the world movement's partners and colleagues are in danger. What solidarity actions have you been part of, in the recent months and years that you may want to share with us? I want to start with Antoine. Antoine, can you respond to this question?
Thank you, Glenis, and it's a real pleasure to be all together and try to share our ideas on these new forms of solidarity. To answer your question, there are many ones, but what I want to highlight is that in the list of countries that you refer to, it should also be noticed that human rights defenders, journalists, civil societies are not only under attack, they have been mobilizing. And this, for me, is the most important. And this is the reason why they have been under attack. But the most striking may be that in the past 2-3 years, civil society mobilization, civic movements have developed and sustained action in an maybe unprecedented number of countries worldwide for so long. The price paid is very high, and indeed, solidarity is very much needed. Uh, Among different examples, I would refer to maybe a well-known campaign, which is the Hold the Line Coalition in support to Filipino journalist Maria Ressa. And Maria will be participating to one of our other panels, so I won't enter too much into details, but that's a worldwide solidarity campaign through, in particular, social networks, but it's multifaceted also. It includes legal mobilization, etc. I've been spending a lot of energy with many colleagues trying to support fellow journalists stay, but when not possible, escape. In particular, recently, Syria, and when I say recently, for the past basically nearly 10 years. You were asking about the last years, that's the example, but also from Myanmar. Now, I want to conclude that first intervention with one other example, which is the type of fighting back solidarity, which I think is extremely important, and that I'm relating to the strategic litigation we've been developing in favor of Roman Petrasovic, the young Belarusian journalist who was and has been arbitrarily detained and tortured by Lukashenko. Following the hijacking of the plane, of the Ryanair plane on 23 May last, we were able with RSF, Reporters Without Borders, to file a lawsuit based on universal jurisdiction in Lithuania before the general prosecutor. The charges based in Lithuanian law relate to hijacking with terrorist purpose, which is in fact what Lukashenko has been organizing, and according to all findings, but in actually our findings based in that lawsuit. And the good news is that the investigation has been opened by the General Prosecutor of Lithuania on that very basis, legal basis, hijacking with terrorist purpose. And it means that for the first time, maybe, an acting head of state practicing terror on on the civilian population of his country, and in particular the journalistic population, journalists among civilian population, is being charged or is being investigated for terrorism. And that's my most recent example I want to flag today.
Thank you very much, Antoine, for that response, as well as spotlighting the Hold the Line campaign that you have done as part of your solidarity actions towards Maria Ressa. And it's really good that Maria is speaking on one of the panel discussions during this assembly, and we'll get to hear more from them as well. Now, I want to turn to you, Daria. In addition to your response around, the solidarity actions that you've been part of, could you share your observation of how Ukraine civil society groups have expressed or acted in solidarity for pro-democracy movements in Belarus?
Sure, I will be happy to respond, Glenis. In Ukraine, we had Revolution of Dignity in 2014, and 100 people were murdered in the central square in Kiev. And we had support, solidarity from so many countries including from neighboring countries and also from across the world. And we recall that moments when similar situations are happening in other countries. When Movement for Democracy started in Hong Kong, we were very moved with Hong Kong activists who used actually a documentary documentary about Revolution of Dignity to encourage activists. Our modest solidarity was simply to support Hong Kong activists through our social media, saying that we deeply care on this other part of the world about what's going on in Hong Kong. Because it's actually the fight for democracy, the fight for human rights, and the fight against autocracy. In terms of Belarus, we are very close to Belarus people. Ukrainians and Belarusians, we share a lot. We share joint history, we share very similar culture, and 80 years of totalitarian regime. Which was intimidating our population and which was intimidating the entire, elite, political, cultural, educational elite. Therefore, we deeply care of what is happening in Belarus, and our practical support in solidarity for Belarusians is simply to support their cause. And what we can do from our side, from Anti-Corruption Action Center, we support the request of Belarus activists for personal sanctions, which has to be imposed against money holders of Lukashenko regime, against oligarchs who are receiving enormous profits from being partners of this autocrat. And we believe that personal sanctions against them, against their family members who reside on the West, will have impact and will return some, justice to which Belarus activists are aspiring. In Ukraine, we also have human rights organizations who are trying to support Belarus activists who have to run away from Belarus and who don't have visas to the EU. They can freely run away to Ukraine and feel here more or less safe, like at home. I would also want to mention Russia. We have very complicated relationships with Russia. Russia runs the war against Ukraine. But I deeply care about Russian Movement for Democracy, particularly those activists and various opposition leaders who are challenging the regime of Putin, the oligarchic kleptocratic regime he set up. They deserve support. And we believe that their call for personal sanctions against Putin money holders is also important. And we think that this is something practical, what the West could do in order to help civil society movement in both Belarus and Russia and in Ukraine, actually, to win this fight for democracy.
Thank you very much for that. That's quite profound. That as activists and civil society organizations, we are able to send that message of resilience, message of hope, to our fellow activists when they're under attack, just to say, look, we are here, we care, and we are watching you and we are supporting you. As an activist myself, I know how valuable that is in terms of strengthening the spirit and actions of activists across the world. And I think I've also seen similar actions coming to Zimbabwean activists, as well as us also giving that cross-border, solidarity to our counterparts when they are under attack. I want to mention in particular, as we have this conversation, what we've been experiencing in Zimbabwe. Since the start of the pandemic, the space for organizing amongst civil society activists as well as organizations is continued to shrink. And of course, we've been seeing, the space shrinking even before, but when things really get bad and, we are all locked out and the state is descending on activists, it's a moment where you really, expect support from anywhere around the world, because it's that voice that matters at a time when everything is, shut down. I want to really commend, the support that was given to civil society and young women political activists in Zimbabwe, who went through torrid times of persecution, abduction, rape, experiencing all forms of sexual violence from the state, just in the name of them having violated COVID-19 regulations. We have 3 young women leaders from, the Movement for Democratic Change, part of whom have been part of civil society initiatives, to promote human rights as well as, advance gender equality. And when they were being brutalized by the state, we really saw tremendous support coming from all corners of the continent as well as even the world. I remember very well, the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter, deriving from African Lives Matter, as part of the entire Black Lives Matter campaign, actually being popular and being used to, trending as part of giving solidarity to, those young women activists, as well as some who've been under attack during the COVID-19 pandemic. And just like we received that, in my organization at the Institute for Young Women Development, we really felt that, it's quite important for us to give the same to other countries. And so when we saw protests happening in Nigeria, the End SARS campaigns, where the police were actually violating, innocent protesters simply demanding for their freedoms and rights, we were actually compelled, to be part of the broader community of the Nigerians and call for the end for the violations in support of the End SARS. And I think we also did the same as well, when the protests were happening in Namibia, around the Shut It All Down campaigns. So this, I think, for me as an activist, really demonstrates the power of solidarity, because what we then see at the end of all these solidarity actions that we do is either you get to have governments either succumbing to our demands, because they're coming from all over the world, they're coming from all over, different places, they succumb and then they end up releasing these people, or at least, the way they deal with them, they know they're being watched. So this is quite profound that you've shared as well, Daria, around the support that you've been giving to Belarusians, as well as what you've also, been receiving in Ukraine. As we continue with this conversation, I want to come back to you again, Antoine. Solidarity actions that we have seen, include not only providing support for those at risk, but also working together on specific challenges. It could be as simple as sharing offices just to reduce, the cost of rentals, especially in a context where funding is reducing in the shrinking resources periods that we are found in. Actually, this was discussed during the recent African regional meeting of the World Movement that we had. Another example, Daria's group hosts a big anti-corruption conference called Zero Corruption Conference every year. It brings together activists and political leaders, not only from Ukraine, but also other countries from the region, as well as other democracies. Daria, could you kindly explain what your organization does and how you use the Zero Corruption Conference, and maybe the other activities as well that you do to mobilize like-minded actors to work in solidarity?
Sure, I'll be happy to describe that. Well, our organization is focusing on tackling grand political corruption, in building various strong institutions, independent institutions in Ukraine, which can resist graft, which can actually ensure justice. We are also focusing on following dirty money across the world and trying to block suspicious activities, suspicious transactions of senior officials and oligarchs who are engaged in corruption. And we're doing that for already 7 or 8 years. I think we've learned something that we can share. And in Ukraine, after the Revolution of Dignity, there was an opportunity for pushing for some reforms. Like, we pushed hard for the asset disclosure system for public officials, and it works well. Now we have one of the most profound system of disclosure of assets of public officials, which is of interest for many other activists and pro-democracy fighters across the world. It's been an interest in Moldova, in Armenia, and we have invited representatives from these countries to the Zero Corruption Democracy in Action conference last week to share our experience. And the Armenians were coming. They visited the National Anti-Corruption Preventive Commission of Ukraine, the agency which was set up after the Revolution of Dignity, and exchanged some experience. And I was very happy that the Armenian delegation actually composed of former activists who entered government when there was the window of opportunities in Armenia. And I think that's the purpose of our Zero Corruption Democracy in Action conference, to share success stories and lessons learned in fighting for democracy and in tackling corruption and dirty money flows. I also think that corruption and vicious circle of corruption, transborder dirty money flows, and strategic corruption, these issues are behind many struggle across the world. Either it is in Africa or in Asia or in Europe, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, or in Latin America or in North America. And I think that joining efforts together in tackling corruption and finding very innovative solutions which citizens can take to expose corruption and to make problems for corrupt officials. This is something that helps our world to get better. And fighting corruption in Ukraine successfully means also changing something on the West. It means also changing how various enablers, lawyers, PR firms, consultants who are being hired by oligarchs behave in the United States or in Austria or in Switzerland. The world is very much interconnected. And solidarity for me means that people from developing world and people from developed democracies have to work together, because democracy is not something given for granted. It has to be democracy in action. People, both in developing world and in developed countries, they have to move. They have to protect human rights. They have to protect dignity. They have to protect justice. And this is where, our cooperation is so important. So basically that's the purpose of Democracy in Action Zero Corruption Conference. I hope next year we will be able to run it in person. This year it was in a hybrid format. And let's exchange our strategies, what works, what doesn't work. I believe that innovative solutions are able to emerge during such exchange.
Quite interesting and really profound for me, Daria, because when you talk of corruption, I think in Zimbabwe and other African states, this is one of the cancers that we have, one of the most difficult issues that we as human rights activists are struggling to tackle, because the very governments that are supposed, to be protecting us are the ones that are oppressing us, because we are challenging the oppression, the corruption that they are doing, and they really do their best to make sure that where you try to surface corruption issues, either you get arrested and silenced that way. So as you talk about, how you're also engaging other countries to make sure that resources expatriated in other countries by corrupt leaders, withheld and sent back to Ukraine or the countries where they are supposed to actually be used. Are you getting, positive responses and feedback, especially from foreign governments, some whom I think would be part and parcel, of supporting these regimes that are actually, that are that corrupt? You mentioned the issue of Russia, for example, is problematic. If you are to take your cases of corruption to Russia and challenge resources, taken to Russia to come back to Ukraine, how's been the responses, from those foreign governments like Russian government?
Obviously, we are not talking to Russian government because it is not a democratic government. It is a hijacked state by Putin and oligarchs whom he is control. But we contact with the United States government, with the government of Switzerland, with the UK, with the EU member states, and this is where money from Putin regime goes. And this is where Putin invests resources robbed from his people into penetrating to financial and political system on the West. And then he uses this dirty money in order to challenge the entire idea of liberal democracy. He's saying democracy is obsolete. And okay, if democracy is obsolete, what is the alternative? Terror? Dictatorship, autocracy, where anyone can kill, when the leader can kill anyone, rape anyone, torture anyone. We in Ukraine lived under such a state for 80 years. We don't want it anymore. And I bet Belarusians also don't want it anymore. So therefore we believe in democracy. Therefore we believe in the united actions of the developed world. We believe in the joint, our aspiration is to join the European Union. I understand that it's probably not relevant for countries in Africa or in Latin America, but those countries which are well developed, when there is human rights, when there is dignity, when rule of law works, they actually attract money of crooks and kleptocrats and autocrats across the world. I think many corrupt officials from Africa probably like to spend their money in Australia. I've heard that they invest funds into some real estate there. And if they are untouchable, if these crooks are untouchable in their home countries, like in Equatorial Guinea, the dictator is there for decades. And my friend Tutu Alicante is, unfortunately, he can't live in Equatorial Guinea, but he lives in the United States, and he works hard in order to create problems for dictator of his homeland in developed countries, and it is very successful. It's been very successful so far in cooperation with the United States. Unfortunately, not all developed countries are focusing that much on strategic corruption and transborder corruption. I'm happy that for the United States, it's now the matter of the core threat to national security. It was just released a week ago that corruption is one of the core pillars in foreign policy and in national policy in the United States under Biden administration. So I suspect that all agencies across the US government will be tasked with very specific things which they have to do in order to tackle transborder corruption. And I expect similar acts and similar policy solutions in other developed countries, in Canada, in Switzerland, in the EU member states, in Australia. We got to use that corruption as just the issue of very poor countries and dictatorship, but it's also a problem of rich countries, because when dirty money are being absorbed from the source country, they are being placed into developed country. And there is the entire group of people and professionals who are helping to hide this money, who are helping to launder and whitewash reputation of groups, and in order to change that side of the equation of strategic corruption, there has to be certain action from the destination countries of corruption, these countries on the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly a problem both ways. The countries where the money is originating, as well as the countries where the money is being deposited. So I think from what you're saying, the Biden policy around corruption, I think for me inspires a lot of hope in how the developed world can start acting, to influence the behavior of these corrupt regimes. As we continue this conversation, I want to paint, a picture where we have a conversation around, the importance of multi-stakeholder coalitions, amplifying voices of civil society, human rights activists at a multilateral or multi-stakeholder platform is a very concrete, action of solidarity. Antoine, you and your colleagues at the Reporters Without Borders has been working with other civil society organizations, governments, business, particularly tech companies, to build a united front to tackle challenges imposed by information technologies on democracy. Could you tell us more about, the coalition, the International Forum of Information and Democracy? How do you make sure that governments and tech companies are in solidarity with and on these issues of disinformation and technologies?
Sure. I will try to answer your two questions and maybe make the connection with Daria's in your own previous word, because I think it relates a lot to the same problematic. If we would listen to predators, kleptocrats, illiberals, their reputation, the representation they give of themselves is perfect, is absolutely perfect. And they build that representation using, including manufactured disinformation. It has reached such a stage, and this is the problem, where we could fear freedom of opinion is at stake, not freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is being used and actually, in a way, abused by those predators so much that facts don't appear anymore as the basis for the public debate. And I can quote Hannah Arendt from 1968, "There is no freedom of opinion if the debate is not based on facts." The question is all the most pressing when we consider the situation of press freedom today in the world. We are basically not more than 10% of the world population able to enjoy press freedom in our own countries. And we know that disinformation circulates 6 times faster than reliable information. That's the problem. If we are to mobilize as co-citizens, fellow citizens, for kleptocrats, corrupt leaders to actually be unveiled and accountable before independent courts, then we need to have a debate which is based on facts. And this has been less and less happening. To confront that problem, we thought that complementary international standards were needed, because we can't find a specific answer to such a situation in positive human rights law or international law or domestic laws. We need a bit more thinking on this, in thinking that puts together knowledge and experience from many circles and everywhere in the world. Surely not only lawyers, surely not only journalists, but tech people, economists, business world, all civil society. And when we look at where to go to have such standards considered, brainstormed, we can see that the normal places for that, UN, regional organizations, don't offer the proper political arena because they're stuck. They're stuck in the new power mapping of the world. So it doesn't mean that we should abandon them. We should be there, but we should imagine altogether alternative ways to circumvent the obstacle. And this is an invitation to build further multi-stakeholder platforms and create a kind of new multilateralism, which is based on our human rights core universal principles, but we can freely elaborate on this. That is the reason why we launched the Initiative for Information and Democracy. And through such multi-stakeholder approach, deliver first a declaration, then a partnership on information and democracy, offering some revisited and sometimes new principles for the public debate in the digital world to find a governance that would allow the public debate to happen and for reliable information to be the one that us fellow citizens based our thinking on, forge our opinions on. This partnership to date has been endorsed by 42 states from different regions. It's a moving process and it's backed up by an inter-NGO civil society organization, the Forum on Information and Democracy, of which ambition is to be to this problematic, to information and democracy, why the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, is to climate issues. A place of permanent, renewed thinking in a field where technology moves very, very, very fast, but which is also fully connected to the major powers of our days. Now, this takes me to your second question, which is how to ensure that government and tech companies are in solidarity on such an issue as democracy and information or disinformation. Well, that's a very challenging question. We can say that for some nearly 20 years, they have been in a kind of solidarity, because that solidarity was based on a concept from 1996 in the Communication Decency Act in the US, and then the correlative laws in the EU and in many countries, that such platforms should not be accountable to nothing, with maybe one exception. But I mean, the principle of no accountability. And this has led to 20 years of development of the law of the jungle in the digital space, not only because it has been fantastic for citizens' mobilization, of course, but also it has led to this situation now of manufacturing disinformation. In that sense, there was a type of solidarity. Laws were made by governments and platforms were very happy with that. Now, that status quo has been changing. We know all what have been the events until very recently about the need to change and introduce some accountability of businesses, in particular of the platforms. In some new law is emerging for that. The question of bringing solidarity of the platforms in these new laws is a big question. Some of them say they are in favor of and they need such developments. Are they sincere is not the question. They are profitable companies, that's all. But they may find their interest in having some such type of new rules coming up and emerging. And this is what the forum is trying to look for through putting on the table very specific recommendations, bringing together, as I said, really colleagues, people, organizations from all over the world, including Maria Ressa, for instance, whom we've been speaking about, like 250 recommendations on fighting disinformations. Tomorrow will be released, so tomorrow will be 16 June, will be released the second report on media sustainability for a new deal for journalism. in that this is these proposals aim at providing material to precisely build that, if not solidarity, convergence of interest between these different powers for us, eventually, the beneficiaries, citizens, to be able to, at a minimum, distinguish in the public digital space between what relates to disinformation, propaganda, ads, and what relates to reliable information. That's a minimum for us to be able to access such information and forge our opinion.
Very, very important indeed, Antoine, because, I can imagine if you were not doing this work in a context where even, journalists, media practitioners, working to defend and promote human rights, are being violated on a day-to-day basis, while, these autocratic states are actually, busy manufacturing false information, they're promoting disinformation. It would really be very, very difficult, to try and address that challenge while at the same time, continue to advocate for the upholding of, press freedoms. So this is quite important work that you are doing. And I like how you, within this, frame of work, have also gone outside the box, to collaborate and think of cooperations with other, unusual kind of suspects or actors in the context of democracy, having business as being part of that, tech companies, these are usually outside, our human rights ambit, but yet they do have a very important role, to play to ensure that we do address issues around, press freedoms, as well as, the safety of the digital space and its continued, support for democracy. So in line with, this thinking around unusual kind of suspects or unusual actors, over the years, the World Movement for Democracy has been exploring, these unusual suspects to bring into the democracy, space. For the past 3 years, the World Movement has actually worked with several musicians in West Africa, creating an informal network of democratically minded musicians to support each other and engage with civic activism along with civil society organizations in the region. The musicians have produced music together, and with their music, they go to local radio stations and discuss democracy, human rights, corruption, and so on. Actually initiating debates around, democracy from people who don't usually speak, democracy issues. You can listen to their music on the World Movement's YouTube channel. The project that we are proud of, for me as a steering committee member of the World Movement for Democracy, is called Music as a Messenger for Democracy. We are concerned about artists increasingly being attacked. In Cuba, Egypt, and other countries, they have introduced laws to limit only on civic space, but also to limit not only civic space, but also artistic space. The networks of artists like the one in the West African region that I've talked about are therefore important, ways to build solidarity among them as artists, as well as with others and other broader democracy activists. Artists is not, art in the work of democracy is not new. But we need to think more strategically about how to work with artists and help them become part of our civil society movements in a way that builds on the work that they are doing, while democracy benefits, from the work that artists do. And I thought that, as Antoine mentioned, working with different actors, it's quite important to also highlight this work that the World Movement for Democracy has been doing, working with artists who are not usually part of the civil society activists. Now coming back to you, Antoine, in the recent past, you discussed the importance of engaging with local governments, cities, provinces, or states in advanced democracies, not necessarily their national governments. Could you please elaborate on this thinking?
Yes, very, very briefly, it's part of what you call the out-of-the-box strategizing, but in fact, I don't know if it's very original. When the ordinary road is stopped, the highway is blocked because of the power mapping, we need to look everywhere. In fact, solidarity happens both for protection or defensive reasons and mobilizations. That's one example. For instance, local governments and cities in many countries in the world mobilizing to host human rights defenders having to rest and respite or to escape. We know, and this is very true, of how many states resist implementing the right to political asylum. And this is true, and real battles have to happen. But we know also how much local governments, cities, very small cities sometimes, and people locally mobilize to actually contribute to protecting refugees, journalists, human rights defenders, and these type of experience have to be highlighted. On a more proactive side, I was very impressed by the mobilization of cities, capital cities, but not only capitals, about climate change. And we even saw new networks or even international organizations created only with the mobilization of such local governments. Remember when Trump decided that the US would de-sign the Paris Agreement on climate change? There was a mobilization of many important cities, including in California, that said that they would continue, they would remain members of this international network of big cities. And all in all, it was maybe more important and more practical and operational than having a federal state, notwithstanding the very important political symbol, and more than political, of having the US federal state back on stage into the Paris Agreement. So this was just briefly to highlight how much in our quest for allies, supporters of democracy, universal standards, we do need to look for allies and friends and supporters everywhere. And I'm deeply convinced that this is and remains the aspiration and deep commitment of the huge majority of the population that knows what we're speaking about or is aware of what democracy means and enjoying it and aspire to enjoying it. Otherwise, why would we see so many sustained movements, mobilization movements of our fellow citizens in the world in so many countries, taking so many risks to actually boost positive change? And for me, that's the very fundamental message that we need to keep about building international solidarities. It is wanted. Democracy is wanted, and solidarity has been in action and is in action.
And talking of building allies, especially with local governments, recently the state of Massachusetts in the United States introduced a law, restricting state government entities from receiving services from companies that are doing business with Burma and Myanmar. Unfortunately, the US Supreme Court struck it down as unconstitutional. But I think from what you have shared with us here, Antoine, this is really a perfect example of how local governments can actually, working independently, try to really influence and organize towards, defending democracy around the world. And quite profound, really, that, democracy is one deed. And solidarity is really part of that. I think that is quite profound, and as part of the conversation that we are having, we are seeing that solidarity and democracy building is not only a responsibility and an obligation of civil society activists and leaders, but really it's about everyone, because you've talked about business, tech companies, as well as local governments, as potential allies in building democracy and defending this valuable principle. Thank you very much for provoking, those ideas and sharing them with the rest of us here. Now I want to turn back to you, Daria.
I'm just saying bye-bye and thank you very much, Glenys, Daria. Sorry. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you to you too. Now I'm turning to you, Daria. Any examples or thoughts on this question of unusual suspects that Antoine, as well as the World Movement for Democracy has shared with us?
Antoine, examples were very inspiring for me. I agree that artists is the group of people whom we have to talk to, engage to our cause, because this is the key to broader society. This is artists. Art is the easiest way to communicate to millions of people. And usually human rights activists, anti-corruption activists, we are very few. And things which we are working on, they are too complicated for broader audience. However, I believe that working with artists can help us to reach out to millions. Still, in the example of my organization, we have to learn how to work with artists. In terms of cooperation between civil society organizations from different sectors, I think this is also very much an issue, and this is important because Antoine talked a lot about disinformation and about various possible solutions, how to tackle disinformation. But in our experience, it is important for human rights, anti-corruption activists and disinformation activists to talk to each other and share what works, what doesn't work in our tools, which we are using. And recently, when we worked on the Democracy in Action Zero Corruption Conference, we collaborated closely with people who are working on disinformation in Ukraine, and we started to name and shame all those journalists who are actually not really journalists, who are spreading disinformation, collecting facts about them doing that, collecting facts about common disinformation narratives, and mapping who are media outlets and social media channels which are being used to promote key, let's say, anti-Western narratives in Ukraine. When you are naming these channels and journalists and providing evidence of the continuous activity in spreading disinformation, it actually makes them nervous, and it has impact, because no one wants to stay in such kind of list of people who are spreading pro-Russian, let's say, or anti-Western disinformation in Ukraine. And also, we have to follow the money. Disinformation has been paid, it costs. So who is paying for this information? Who is the owner of those media and social media? This is important question to answer. And I think this is something that activists working in Ukraine on disinformation kind of learned when we started to work together, because we are usually following the money in investigating corruption, but when we are monitoring disinformation and fighting disinformation, we have to follow the money as well. And work with business, with local communities. I also see lots of possible opportunities there. It is important to engage multi-stakeholders in order to unite everyone for supporting pro-democracy movements. In Ukrainian case, unusual suspects probably would be veterans. We have thousands of veterans who were fighting in the war in the east border of Ukraine with Russia. They are returning back, and they need support. they need jobs, and also if they receive jobs, they can be very, they can contribute a lot to the cause for democracy, because they paid a lot, high personal cost for sustaining democracy, and getting them back to civil life, and making sure that they feel they contribute to the society, and they fight the war, but with other tools and with other weapons, the war for democracy. It also unleashes a lot of good energy, which we need to promote the cause for democracy.
Very interesting ideas indeed. And while I'm still talking to you, Daria, before I let you go, the World Movement for Democracy held an event in Ukraine in April that was focused on anti-corruption efforts, as corruption remains a major challenge in Ukraine, as you've put it across. The event, included one of your colleagues, Vitaly Shabunin, the board chair of Anti-Corruption Action Center, and he was one of the event speakers. Along with Vitaly, we had Alexander Chumak, who's the president of the Association of Private Employers based in Kavak. Interesting to learn that business owners are eager to address, corruption as they highlighted during the event. And it seems that, business people want to be part of, the solution rather than being part of the problem of corruption. How do you see business in Ukraine and globally as partners in your work to tackle corruption?
I see that business who wants to pay taxes and business who wants to play fair games, they are probably those who benefit the most from the fight against corruption and in setting up independent anti-corruption institutions and fair justice. Honestly, I think that in Anti-Corruption Action Center in Ukraine, we can do better in cooperating with business. We have to find the way how to engage business in pushing for our cause. And specifically, we have very strong tech companies in Ukraine, IT engineers who wants to contribute for the good cause. And we are now partnering with one tech startup in building a database of politically exposed persons of Ukraine. This is database which helps to prevent money laundering of corrupt officials. So business is helping us to analyze big data, to transform this big data into user-friendly format, which can be used by financial institutions across the world in order to identify high-risk clients, politically exposed persons among their clients, and prevent the flow of dirty money. This is a small example of cooperation with tech business in Ukraine, but I truly believe that we are probably using 1% of the potential of cooperation. A lot more has to be done.
Yeah, I think it's quite similar to Zimbabwe, where those companies that are willing to pay the taxes, which in our case are very few now, are the ones that are willing to have this conversation around confronting corruption. But the majority of the businesses who actually benefit from the corruption that has inflicted our societies still remain a bit on the margins when it comes to having conversations around corruption. And I think, like you're saying, it's quite a long haul that we have to go to ensure that we identify businesses that are willing to collaborate with us and work with us in fighting corruption in our countries. With this, we have come to the end of our event. I think one of the best session, expertly tackled by my civil society leaders that I was having on the panel, who talked about issues, around the importance of solidarity, both within countries, interregional, as well as, internationally. And I think from what we have had here, the cost of democratic organizing has become very high. It's very high for civil society leaders, for human rights defenders, including even for artists, as well as, media practitioners. So this really calls for the need for solidarity cross-sector, as well as regionally and globally. And I think from the examples that we have had about the work that Daria's organization, as well as, Antoine's, organization working with Report Without Borders is doing is actually quite, tremendous and commendable in terms of continuously providing solidarity, as well as challenging governments to ensure that, civil society leaders continue to do the work that they do in defending democracy. We have also, talked about the importance of alliance building across the sectors, going beyond just, the civil society realm, where we talk about human rights defenders, where we talk about, media practitioners, but actually also thinking of collaborating and cooperating with local governments, for example, with tech companies, as a way of upholding democratic principles, in particular holding governments accountable, as well as, challenging those governments that are corrupt. Quite, I think, an interesting as well as insightful conversation that we've had here. And I want to thank my panelists, Antoine Bernard, thank you very much, as well as Daria Kalinic. It was quite interesting, having conversations with you and learning more about the work that you're doing in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gladys.